Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Pete Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa, since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. So it's just approaching 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, March the 26th, and this is the first of the Talking Transformation podcast bulletins of the Series 2. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Cathy Stone to help me set the scene for what's coming and perhaps reflecting a bit on the first series over the last 2.5, almost 3 years now that we've been going. Cathy, welcome. Really great to have you with us this afternoon. Whereabouts do we find you?
Thank you, Pete. At home in Sea Point on this glorious African summer day.
Indeed, and what makes me wonder why we're doing this indoors over Zoom. We should be out there. We should be out there doing this, walking the streets, or at least doing Sea Point Promenade. But Cathy, thanks so much for spending the time and your own family time just to check in. You've been one of the regular contributors. You and I, we've worked together. We've become great friends over the last few years. I just thought it was completely appropriate that if we're going to start just looking back a bit at that first series, and I'll get to why I'm saying this is Series 2 versus Series 1 in due course, but it was absolutely appropriate that you're part of this. And I think there were a few questions that you might have. I've certainly got a few things I wanted to reflect on. I thought, who better? So I'm going to hand over the reins to you. You're in charge, you're in control, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Pete. It's been a real privilege to have traveled some of this journey with you. And it's something really to be proud of. I mean, in 2018-19, there were a few conversations, certainly that I was part of, that about the need for a platform to discuss planning in South Africa, to exchange ideas, delve into the good, bad, and the ugly. But you picked up the baton, Pete, and Talking Transformation was born. Your first podcast launched in 2019 with Professor Harrison in a vegan restaurant in Sea Point. And we're now 37 episodes, 12 Code of a Diary episodes, and 2 deep dives later, 13,930 listens, over 100 guests and listeners from over 80 countries. What an achievement, Pete. Why did you start this?
I think when we look at those numbers, Cathy, it is somewhat, it's quite surprising because as you'll remember, this all came about through very humble beginnings and really just a desire to have a conversation and a bit of an archive of material of, all the conversations that seem to be going on. Certainly at that stage in 2019, it was clearly predating the whole Zoom era and the webinars online. Much of that debate was going on in person via what are typically quite expensive events. And I think this was born out of an event at Century City. As I recall, it was the Western Cape Property Developers Forum. You were in the audience. I was in the audience. I think others like Rob McGaffin, Helen Rourke from DAG and others were there. And I just got a sense that listening to really rich content was to say, this is a real shame that other people are not going to get the benefit of this. And at the same time, if you recall, I think that was when the whole question of CPD, that continuous professional development, was coming into the realm of SAC Plan and the South African Planning Council. I think there was a bit of a fear factor around how do we get CPD points if I've got to pay 7,000 rand a day to attend a conference. So yes, there's always been the option to review books or book chapters or academic articles. That's always been part of the CPD frame. But I was also thinking, isn't there a way that when people are out and about going about their business or stuck in traffic in the commute, stuck in the taxi on the way into work, how do you access some material that doesn't require huge amounts of data, doesn't require a huge subscription cost? So this idea was to say, right, let's have a series of conversations with our networks, and certainly if those people that I've mentioned, that is a very, very big global network of people that we have access to. And then start putting content out which may help at least people who are thinking about these issues, and particularly the younger planners who I think have really had it rough. Trying to inspire. I think that was the other thing, was to say, right, it's not all bad news. And in South Africa, we know it's been a hell of a ride. And I always think of that watershed moment, the 2010, take the blue pill, and we become probably one of the most economically productive superstars in the economic field because of that feel-good factor. Take the red pill, and we saw it's a state capture version of South Africa, which has, I think we're seeing it through the commission, has squandered so much opportunity, whilst so many people in different guises, whether it's through the public sector, private sector, the NGOs, the academics, have all been trying to build something that's better and a more prosperous future for South Africa. So that's where it came from. But it really was about saying, let's have an archive of material where you can go back and dip in. And, if people are researching a particular topic, it's not necessarily going to have the academic rigor, but it may have some really interesting sound bites that people can use and reference and then go deeper into. And it was really nothing more than that, but certainly adding to a dimension that was arguably missing at the time.
And let's be honest, right? I mean, so much of the knowledge we generate as planners comes out of conversation, comes out of dialogue. What you've done in terms of convening those conversations around really, really important and current topics can't be underestimated. And I think the platform you chose, I know you've always been a big podcast follower in music and cricket, and they've been fairly big globally for a while, but they've actually been slower to pick up in South Africa. And I think in many ways, particularly in our field, you were a pioneer using a new kind of technology, a new method. And what are the lessons from that?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think what's really encouraging, let's start with where we're at now in 2022, and some of the lessons and what we're seeing is there are other platforms that have emerged. And it was never about, we want to be a singular, like we want to be the only podcast in South Africa dealing with these issues. That was really not the ambition. Because there's just simply not enough time in the day. We work, all of us who contribute, who've anchored or been involved in the podcast, we work full time. But we've seen the likes of, we're going to probably pick up some of the conversations with Daniel Klaassen, his work on Future Cities Africa, and his using a sort of YouTube platform, so a very strong audiovisual. That's great. We've seen the young urbanists really putting some excellent webinars out in the space. I think of the recent debate between the mayor-elect, or as he became Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis, and the previous political head in spatial planning, or the old Transport Development Authority, Brett Herron. That was really an interesting and innovative platform, and again, more strength to the young urbanists. So we've seen a couple of these things emerge over the last couple of years, and it's really, really exciting. And I think that sort of the collaboration about where we want to take this is going to be more and more dipping into Dan and the young urbanists and seeing how can we collaborate and build. I also think what we saw, and maybe we touch on it in different ways, but it was interesting during that whole COVID period of looking how other countries were dealing with not just the pandemic, but the conversations. And on the one hand, I remember very clearly turning around and saying, perhaps we can use the podcast as a vehicle to have conversations beyond South Africa. It's always been about South Africa, but I think we already had some international guests who had given a very interesting and diverse take on some of the issues, whether it was community safety or about the renewal in city building, etc. And the opportunity COVID of saying we've got a community of ex-South African or South Africans who are living elsewhere. We can tap on them and understand how they're doing. And some people we approach said, I just need to get through the day, and I don't have the time to even think about. I don't want to think about talking about it on a podcast, which is completely. We respected that completely. But others really wanted to get involved. So I think we went off on a nice tangent there around the COVID diaries, which was I think something we can look back on in years to come and think about, how are people feeling, and the way that Eloise, for example, a former colleague of both you myself, talked about, being 37 floors up in Hong Kong, overlooking the city there, and the buildings being locked down, and at the same time, what we didn't talk about was at that time, the huge change and political strife that was going on in Hong Kong itself. So some very interesting conversations being had, some of which were very talked about, others that were happening behind, sort of off the microphone. when we looked at elsewhere around the world, it was clear to me that, for example, the RTPI, the Royal Town Planning Institute in the UK, was doing some amazing work. And what you saw was a huge burgeoning in sort of DIY YouTubing within the profession. Lots and lots of conversations being had, very much, recorded in on a Zoom call that was recorded, no editing, no fancy music, none of the things that we tried to, make the Talking Transformation podcast about. We wanted it to sound good. We wanted to have a very strong identity. The logo that Marco Giretto, one of our guests, one of our former colleagues there living now in Sydney, who helped us put this together. This was just on the fly. Those guys were on an almost daily basis putting out new content, and it was demonstrating to me that it's about the confidence of, it's not even about being the best podcast. It's not about the best voice. It's about getting out there, doing it, putting out a conversation and seeing if you can get a response on it. And all of a sudden, I saw the RTPI in particular growing this enormous knowledge base, literally over that period of COVID. And that goes beyond even when we went and knocked on their door to try and ask, how are you doing this? What else are you doing? And they talked about their apprenticeship schemes, their young planning programs. It was really inspiring. And sadly, when we looked closer to home, what we saw was a very different picture around our own professional sort of our placement within the conversation of COVID about whatever that building back better, whatever that means. It was really, really disappointing to see that we were nowhere in the debate, really. And I think that's where, in a small way, that the podcast and those COVID diaries were at least a way of communicating and reaching out. But that's just some immediate thoughts, Cathy. And I know I've talked there about COVID per se, but major reflection was we managed to establish a platform. It's become, I think, within at least the built environment, it seems to be getting out each month. We seem to be, I'm having word of mouth, people saying, I'm really enjoying the podcast. And it's been, that in itself has been such it's made all the effort and all of those, do we do this? Do we not do it? What's it going to take? That's done now. And the results are there. There's an archive, even if it stops tomorrow, there's, I say, there's probably 50 plus episodes of really rich content that people can dip into.
Yeah. And I mean, you did a really great job of pivoting during COVID, but also pivoting when kind of key issues arose or key conversations were going on, like with your deep dives. So outside of COVID, what are the kind of real highlights of the conversations that you've had over the last 2 to 3 years in the Talking Transformation podcasts?
Well, there's so many. I guess each episode represents a particular highlight. There's a huge amount of effort that goes in preparing, in the recording and the effort of the individuals, and then the edit that goes on behind the scenes. Those are not no small things. But I mean, I do look back on certain episodes with a great deal of pride, and the one with Dr. Jana El-Khor, who talked to us about sort of community safety and violence in communities, one of the very early ones. And most importantly, one of the ones I didn't know, I hadn't met her, I didn't know her at all, and was very sort of meekly approached to say, I've got this thing, it's really in its fledgling stages. Would you be prepared to speak to me? And she was working for the World Bank, and she was just hugely positive and said, of course. And we had this really interesting conversation. And of all the people we've had on the podcast, that one I think still strikes home of somebody who was really phenomenal in terms of her commitment, her observations, and just the passion that she has and the experience. I think so. She had really understood these issues, lived through them, and was now working as in this sort of peacemaking and healing space. That was a remarkable episode, and one I still go back to from time to time. Picking up conversations with people I had long fallen out of contact with and got back into contact with. For example, Dr. Claudio Azzioli. He had been one of my lead lecturers in the Netherlands back in 2004, 2005, when I took a course on there. And he was kind enough. I think he'd just come out of being the top man in the UN housing and land issues, and spent an hour and a half talking. I think I called it masterclass. Just listening to him. Here's a guy who's academic, but has been literally dug the trenches and being with communities to rejuvenate those communities in a very particular way. So that was a special one for me, hooking up with somebody after such a long period of being out of contact. And then I think you'll remember, Cathy, you were there. You'll remember that episode we did live, still to this day, the only live episode we did with an audience of about 60 people at CIFA, Cape Institute for Architects in Hout Street in CBD. That was amazing because it was a big, from a technological point of view, from a recording point of view, it was a huge problem, given that we were working with very basic equipment. But we had a really strong panel. We had a major response to that. You were kind enough to step in as a summarizer, and I think it was no small
massive challenge.
It was no small
with that
task.
Amazing panel.
It was no small task. But what was nice is we covered everything, if you recall, from the youngest member, an intern working with me in the city of Cape Town, through to the likes of Prof. Virili at UCT, Zereru, Urban Real Estate Unit. So, Barbara Southworth, well known to yourself, and as the experienced pro. That was an amazing thing that we pulled off. I think a lot of the planning had been undertaken when I was in Australia, and I was traveling around Australia at the time thinking, how am I going to pull this off? Because there were so many dependencies, and we still managed. I think Lwazi Mabaza from the city was kind enough to step in literally the last hour. Because we were let down by one of our panel guests who was going to represent the activists angle, and so we had a public sector official who, if you know Lwazi, a really top man, and stepped in and tried to give us a bit of a provocation from an activism from within the public sector organization, being the city. That was great, Cathy, and I think that was. I'm really hoping we can see more of that in the months to come, in the episodes to come in this next series.
I mean, talking about that, Pete, I mean, I suppose this incredible role you've played in setting this up and convening these conversations is an activist role. And it's no mean feat running a public conversation while being a public servant in South Africa. It's not encouraged necessarily that public servants put them out there and engage in public conversations. And it must have been quite tough, quite a fine line to toe from time to time.
Yes and no. From the get-go, I need to extend a particular word of thanks to the ED at the time, Ossie Asmal, who was kind enough when I said, "Look, I'm really keen to do this, and I feel I have to do it. It's a calling, and I hope you'll support me in my ambition, and not just say, well, you can't because you work for the city, and therefore it would be a conflict of interest." He was very supportive of that, and I'm extremely grateful to him and my director for allowing me to get into that space and to go ahead and publish the first of the episodes. I think the other thing that I'd sort of set out, and I was really looking some of my notes from the email that I sent from that Western Cape conference, which was to say, it would be improper that we end up talking about issues which are necessarily immediately within my or the guest, or if whoever at that stage I had the idea that there'd be multiple podcast anchors, it wouldn't just be me, that we wouldn't necessarily talk about our own projects or our own issues. And so I think for probably the first 10 or so episodes, I tried to stay deliberately A, away from Cape Town, and B, from anything about, I'd love to talk about the Municipal Spatial Development Framework or the Built Environment Performance Plan, land use models, all these things that have been typically my work for the last 8 years here in Cape Town. But I think that would have been improper. And so we stayed away from that. There were some issues that came very close to home in the city's space. I think particularly of the episode with the Super Troopers and the amazing work that they did and were doing. That was recorded just before lockdown. It was probably one of the last episodes that we had recorded prior to lockdown. And that one with the Super Troopers was probably the closest one where there was quite a strong criticism of the city's approach. I tried to be very, very faithful to the interview, and I think I had to make one or two very small edits about people's names and so forth, just to because the last thing I wanted to do was to get anybody into trouble or end up being, in any sort of legal issues around. That's not what this was about. So, yes, that's probably the closest it came to having to make major decisions around edits. But I think we've picked material and topics which are relevant and actually can support the work that we're doing. I think that's what I often said is this is not about my work, but it's about the nature of the work that I do. And I thought that was an important distinction. So it wasn't about Pete Ahmad, the manager of Metro Spatial Planning in Cape Town. It was about all these things that were keeping myself and my colleagues busy and thinking maybe this topic will actually help stimulate some of the thinking within the city, within province, within the profession, and have us questioning each other about, well, is there a way that we can improve the conversation?
It is quite a thing to keep up the momentum, right? There's so much to talk about. There's so many people to pull in. And I mean, you really did an amazing job, keeping up the momentum with about 2 episodes a month. It was really impressive. But we've noticed over the last 6 months, so there's been a hiatus. So what's been up, Pete?
I got to a point, I think it was around August, September. I think the last episode went out either August or September, I forget now. And that was on the whole question of public and state-owned land within Cape Town. So yeah, one of the episodes that was closer to home here in Cape Town, looking at a very highly politicized question of state land and state land release within very well located areas in the city. And it was one of the most popular episodes we've done, actually. It's been really encouraging to see the response to that particular episode. Something had to give. At that stage, I was involved. I was acting as a director within our space and in the workspace, and working towards the conclusion of my studies, studying this executive master's through London School of Economics, which has been fantastic. And again, one of the upcoming episodes is going to be reflecting exactly on that academic journey, not my journey, but the course on cities. Why did it come about? And we're talking to the 2 co-directors of the course. That's something I'm really looking forward to. But it really was getting to that point, Cathy, where something had to give between family and work and the podcast and studies. It really was a time just to scale back on one of them. And I think it was appropriate. I think the amount of content was there. There was anybody who wanted to still dip into any of the conversations could do so. It was always going to be there as an archive. And my ambition was, as soon as the studies finished in end of February, that slowly but surely I would reboot the podcast series. And I think over this last 2 weeks, as the conversations, as some of the recordings, we've already got 1 episode already recorded. There'll be this bulletin on the 1st in a few days' time, on the 1st of April. There'll be another recording. So the idea was to say, you know what, we reboot it. And we'll call this series 2. And I suppose that's as much now to do with my transition out of the public sector. First time in 26 years, I won't be working for government in South Africa. April 1st will be my first day as an independent town planner. It seemed appropriate. Let's change up the series. Let's archive that series 1. I think there'll be opportunities to have a slightly more at times outspoken on some of these issues, and I've deliberately played sort of a bit of a back seat, because that's my job, is to be the facilitator of the conversation, not necessarily to have the opinion. But maybe that does change in the weeks and months to come, and that's the reason, Cathy. It was purely around time, the amount of hours in a day, and my need to try and keep afloat. But really looking forward to this series 2. There's also going to be some really interesting conversations. Another bulletin we'll be recording in the coming weeks will be with the UKESA. UKESA is the Urban Knowledge Exchange Southern Africa, and Mark Napier and the sort of the remnants of the Urban Land Institute work towards the end of the 2000s. And there's a massive archive of material there, really impressive, that I'll be encouraging people to engage with. We'll be talking to Mark about how we've taken all that archive material from series 1. We'll have the episode logged, archived there. That's probably going to become the main sort of web home for the podcast going in the future.
That's fantastic, Pete. And actually, yeah, that's where I was going to go. I mean, what with undertaking this master's and this big shift in your career, It's no doubt going to bring a different energy to Series 2, and I think we're all looking forward to that a great deal. So looking back and looking forward, in terms of what you've got in store for us, what do you see as the kind of big transformation themes that need to be carried forward in the conversations going forward?
It is going to be interesting to see what the longer term impact, economically speaking, is of this COVID thing. I'm really interested, and I think I'm going to be going back to those episodes with Francois Virli that we did in the early days when a lot of this thing was about what changes. I still believe that, and I'm certainly no authority on things like rental agreements in the commercial sector, but it strikes me that we've seen such a fundamental change over this last 2 years of people and businesses who've employed people who've had to work from home, and those that have made it through this period of transition, I think are going to be making some very hard economic decisions when those renewals come up. Now, those renewals, as I understand, are typically signed over a 2 to 3 year period, or perhaps even longer. So people are going to be looking at, do I renew or not? Do I renew with the same amount of floor space, or do I reduce? Or do I forego my address in the CBD of, for example, Cape Town, or in Century City, or out towards Wynberg for the home? And with the oil price, we've seen that's done. We saw last week, I think, one of the national ministers saying we should be encouraging people to stay at home because of the oil and because of the fuel costs. So the narrative is almost staying the same. I work from home, but for a different reason now, not just the pandemic, but because of the economic constraints. I think that's still going to be an interesting space to watch, Cathy. I think we're in for an interesting shift in the way we've seen how Cape Town, some of the pedestrianisation initiatives have taken place, which is, I think, on the one hand, encouraging. Will it be a longer term trend? The age-old question of how do you change in particular, and I'm going to use Cape Town here again as an example, where affordable housing in that space has been a constant thorn in government's side. And I'm saying it's across all spheres, not just the city. But how you can actually sort of what would be, from a market point of view, feasible and would work. I think that's the type of thing that I'm hoping that we'll start to see in this sort of transformation lead headline around what can be done in those spaces which potentially become redundant or repurposed. And just to say, well, we're going to repurpose it for more co-working space, I think that's finite. What we need is, and I keep coming back in that CBD to the places like Christian Barnard Hospital, enormous building with so many key workers in that space. The civic center of the city alone, all of whether it's the cleaners, the security, those working in the customer care call centers and so forth. There's a major Take-A-Lot and Superbalist, all these brands that are there with people who are looking for convenience of place of work versus a place of residence. And I think there's there's surely an opportunity here to try and improve that affordable offering. And I'm really hopeful in that space. The other thing, Cathy, which is a remnant, if you like, of the COVID period, was this whole de-densification thing. And I think that was one of the more disturbing parts of the COVID lockdown period, was this idea that we're going to de-densify, whether it's the Noon or other majorly overcrowded areas because of the fear of the pandemic and the spread. Now, I think that was a really good example of where we're saying, we're rebranding this thing, when actually what we're talking about is we need to fast track what we've been talking about for 20 years, which is better land assembly, better strategic land coming into play, as in that's available and can be developed for affordable housing or affordable land and infrastructure projects. So yeah, I think these are challenges which will continue to vex. We've seen last year, Cathy, you'll remember, I think it was July, the trauma in the country around the protests, particularly in KZN, and other parts of the country. But I think we were very fortunate in the Western Cape not to see that. I was speaking with some friends from the Howick area there in KZN and telling me how terribly affected that area had been through the violence in July last year. And I think we foresaw what it could look like if we don't get this right. And if that's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. And I don't think that wake-up call, by the way, equates to building the Lanseria airport new city either, or the Lanseria city, or the Port Shepstone. I think these are strange, interesting concepts which I don't fully appreciate. I must be honest, I don't know the full detail of them. They just seem completely incongruous with what I believe are the more direct city building initiatives, which is a Dunoon, and it's the pace of change in that space and how we're resourcing that, as opposed to multi-billion rand investments on the fringe of our cities, where with the usual artist impression, which looked really impressive, but certainly seemed to be incongruous with the realities, not even 10 kilometers away, for example, in Diepsloot in the Lanseria case.
I mean, I suppose one's tempted to say that the more things change, and they do change, and they change very rapidly, then in some ways in our field, the more things stay the same. It's about, I suppose, really getting to the nub of the conversations, but also looking for those stories of hope, right? Like you talk about picking up on developers who are really taking the bull by the horns when it comes to affordable housing, and other people doing amazing things. And I think the beauty of the podcast is also that it can kind of connect us to colleagues across the country and across the world, while it's so difficult to connect, physically connect these days, or it's rather not difficult, but rare and increasingly expensive. So we're really looking forward to the next chapter and I'm sure the next chapter for you professionally will reverberate very much into the podcast. And I think that's really exciting. There is just so much to talk about, right? It's about one step at a time, finding those topics that we really want to engage with. And there's so many amazing people doing amazing things and thinking very hard. I mean, I think you can be really proud of the incredible caliber of people that have really responded and partnered with you, and the wisdom that they've shared has been really, really, I think, a resource. And as you say, you've developed this archive, but also a comfort and help in trying to make sense of this world that we work in. So all the best of luck, Pete. I think it's really exciting to have Talking Transformation back on board.
Cathy, thanks so much. And I mean, I really appreciate you, taking the time and helping the two of us reflect on the last couple of years. I just want to pick up on one thing that you talked about there, and the contributions from the guests. I mean, obviously, this thing is nothing without them, and that's why I've always tried to make it, really, really appreciate the time, appreciate the sacrifices that people make coming on. As I say, nobody gets paid a cent. There's not 1 cent that's been made out of the podcast. And, the depth of the commitment and the passion of our guests is something really to behold. Not once did I question somebody's sort of, sincerity or commitment to whatever it was they were talking about. And sometimes I think we've seen it in our career, somebody who's talking a good game, but, if you scratch, are you really committed to this? And I think we haven't ever looked to trip anybody up, but when you ask a series of questions and people keep responding in such a positive and committed way, I think that's really, really tells you a lot, that there are many people who are out there that they are committed to this project of South Africa and the project of building back, not from just COVID, but really this wasted opportunity from 2010 onwards. Many would argue, and I'm certainly subscribed to that we've missed huge opportunities. So yeah, I think that's been really, really, really one thing of saying we can replicate some of this. We should shout about some of it. We should be very proud of the people that we do have, and those who are doing great work need to be recognized, and we need to find more and more ways to get them out there and hear more from them. So Cathy, to you, thanks very much. Any final thoughts from your side before we wrap?
No, I think just to say that bringing those people onto a platform like Talking Transformation, creates this incredible opportunity for others to share in their work, to share in their passion. And I really think that is really all the best for the next series. I think I'm really looking forward to listening, to partnering on the odd occasion, maybe to sending you a whole lot of topics and hints and people that I think you really would enjoy talking to. And I'm sure there are many others that you've built a community in this process. And thank you and all the best.
Thank you, Cathy. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Keep your eyes open. I think April the 1st, the first of the episodes, the formal episodes will roll. We'll be recording another episode at least on April the 1st as well. So there'll be a second episode that will come out shortly thereafter. And there's already a series of conversations going on. So I would anticipate in the next couple of months, we'll see 3 or 4 new episodes available. Looking forward to hearing people's response to that. And in the meantime, to all of the listeners, all the very best. Look forward to seeing you on the journey of Series 2. And thanks for your time. We hope you enjoyed this content of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. That's @TalkingTransfo and the number 1. Or alternatively, via our email address, talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Thanks and recognition also to Tribal Need for allowing us to use their track Flags as our introductory and closeout music on this podcast.